you are right about the obsession of the gallery in being far more interested in that than in the comments about arresting and deporting Jote, or Carney and Brookfield, or Carney in anything, or Trudeau in anything. I mean, it's been a frustration of mine for years.
6 days after Mark Carney unveiled his so-called generational budget, almost nobody in the media is asking the most important question. What's actually wrong with it? Instead, Ottawa is consumed with rumors, hoaxes, and manufactured drama, exactly the kind of distractions Mark Carney needs right now. So today, we're talking to somebody in the press gallery who refuses to play along. Brian Lindley has already called this budget a stinker and described Ottawa's reaction as a full-blown feeding frenzy, one that conveniently pulls attention away from the numbers Canadians should be worried about. Brian, welcome back to Northern Perspective.
Thanks for having me. I got to correct you on one thing. I am no longer a member of the press gallery. Not that there's anything wrong with being a member. I'm a member of the Queen's Park Press Gallery still. I should, say that, but I haven't been a member of the Ottawa one in a while. Still know what it's like. Still know the feeding frenzies that they have, and that the whole Ottawa bubble is basically high school cafeteria with salaries.
Well, that's an interesting way to put it, because I think that's the way it's mostly perceived between all the Canadians around the world that are watching this, whether they're in Canada or abroad. So let's get into the budget first, and then the media's reaction to it. So Mark Carney drops a $78.3 billion budget, or over $36 billion more than the deficit than Trudeau was going to forecast for this year. He's looking at spending $324, depending on who you listen to, $billion more in a deficit over the next few years. And we're supposed to think that this is the way out of this economic disaster that Canada has been thrown into over the last 10 years. So from luxury taxes on yachts being taken off to, talks about possibly protecting non or minority employees in the government's cuts that are coming up to the federal public service. What is your take on this budget being a stinker, as you say?
It had no focus. It was originally put forward that this would be an austerity budget. It's not. Then it was, it'll be transformational, generational transformation. It's not. It would be that we will spend less so we can invest more. No, we're spending more so that we can spend more. Let me give you some numbers. Revenues are down. Last year, total government revenues were $511 billion. This year, they'll be about $507 billion. So about $4 billion less than last year. But we're going to spend more than $585 billion. So that's the $78.3 billion deficit. Most of us have no idea, Ryan, what a $1 billion looks like. Never mind $78.3 billion over. Like, I think we can all relate to, I'm a bit short this week, or, but billions? No, none of us have an idea of what billions of dollars look like, but that's what the government's doing. $78.3 billion deficit. The debt services charge just to pay the interest on the national credit card is $55.6 billion. That's about $1 billion more than the federal government will spend on healthcare services. And yet Mark Carney goes before the Canadian Club here in Toronto and says, well, all these other people want to, revert to trickle down economics, and then we just have to cut all the healthcare funding and all the dental programs and all. Look, that's not the problem. The problem is that this is a government that has a spending problem. Mark Carney has spent the last several months talking about how Justin Trudeau's annual spending increases were unsustainable. And he's 100% right about that. They were, and he said he would fix it. So what were Justin Trudeau's annual spending increases? On average, over a decade, or close to a decade, he increased spending by 8%. That's the average annual spending increase over Trudeau's time in office. Mark Carney's first budget, program spending is up 7.2%. What's the difference between 7.2% and 8%? It's negligible. It's less than 1% difference. So this is not an austerity budget. There's no measures in here that would be generational transformation in terms of altering the economy. They've got the super deduction they keep talking about for businesses to do a write down. I've talked to folks that help companies deal with these sorts of things, and they said it's not going to bring any more money to the table. It might just speed a few things up, but in terms of actual investment, won't do it. So this budget was a nothing burger. So the biggest gift that Mark Carney got was that Politico dropped the story a couple of hours before the budget broke that Chris d'Entremont was thinking of crossing the floor, which is like, I'm halfway pregnant, Ryan. No, you're either pregnant or you're not. So Chris d'Entremont, here's something for viewers to keep in mind. The news about Chris d'Entremont not only shocked the Conservative caucus, not only shocked the media, it shocked Chris d'Entremont. He didn't know that he was on the record. He didn't know that the folks at Politico, kudos to them for getting that scoop. I mean, there's no better scoop than that in the middle of a budget lockup when all other eyes are on the budget and you're like, hey, check this out. This guy's going to cross the floor or might. Well, there's no might. Once you've made it public, you're no longer in the Conservative caucus.
Well, and just to unpack a little bit of what you said, the one thing that I think is very significant is you're right. Canadians cannot conceptualize $1 billion, never mind $100 billion or 78 billion or whatever it is. So we try and make it more digestible for Canadians in that for every $1 billion we go further into debt, that costs every Canadian, whether they're 2 weeks old or 90 years old, it costs them another $25 a year. So if we're looking at $100 billion deficit this year, that's going to cost you another $2,500 at some point in your life because they are mortgaging the future of all Canadians. So congratulations, you were born. I think already it's something like $30,000 you owe the government as soon as you come into this world. And then for every billion more.
Makes you feel good, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, makes you feel part of the family, I guess. You're joining in the misery. But as it comes to Chris d'Entremont, yeah, he was surprised because we've actually had some accounts from MPs that were in the House when that broke. And all of the Conservatives were looking at their phones because they started blowing up. And then everyone just stopped, looked up at Chris. And I think he realized something was wrong, turned around and saw his whole caucus looking at him, grabbed his budget, walks out. So I don't know how you have the stones to even do that. But then we got accounts of Andrew Scheer and Chris Workington barging into his office, knocking people over like NFL football players. There's been so much spin to this. And this is a good segue into the next question. And we already know the answer to this, but how can the media during a budget week barely talk about the actual budget? To your point, and you raise this in your video, that they're not talking about the party that's actually in government, that actually is making things happen. They're talking about the opposition, which is just going to vote against this budget. How can the media just be completely obsessed about this?
Well, so I'm going to try and be fair to my media colleagues. Everyone did file on the budget. Everyone did report on the budget. Every outlet had their stories, had their TV packages, had their big print packages for the newspapers and radio. Here's the problem, Ryan. Nobody cared. I put out my budget pieces. I see what the traffic is like on those. And then I put out something on Chris d'Entremont or Matt Genereux, and traffic is way higher because that's what people are clicking on. That's what they're paying attention to. It's far sexier. It's a better sell. Conservatives in disarray. Look, there is some push going on, and like the Toronto Star today had a I don't know if it was their headline or if it's just how they portrayed it on X, but it was, we haven't seen this kind of disarray in Ottawa in decades. I'm sorry. December 16th, 2024.
8 years, 8 months ago.
Yeah. Well, no, that's 11 months ago.
Oh, that's true.
Chrystia Freeland walks in, stabs Justin Trudeau in the front, not the back, says, I'm resigning because you stink, because you're not leading, because we have spent so much money that we have no fiscal capacity to deal with what's coming from Donald Trump. Remember, she did this before Trump was inaugurated, but about 3 weeks after Trump was threatening 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And so she looks at the fiscal update and says, oh, like, there's no room left for us to maneuver. And so she resigns on the day she's supposed to deliver this. Prior to that, we had members of the Liberal caucus signing a letter calling for him to resign. It's being passed around in the Liberal caucus. We had months of intrigue. Like, look, this is maybe the biggest floor crossing since Belinda Stronach, perhaps, but it's not even as consequential as Belinda Stronach. That helped save the Paul Martin government. I was there for that. Does anyone even remember Wajid Khan crossing from the Liberals to the Conservatives? Or are you just starting to Google who is Wajid Khan at this point? A lot of these things are a flash in the pan stories. Some of them are consequential. But to say we haven't seen this in decades, give me a break. Now, but this is what people want to talk about right now. And so, it's understandable that the media is going to feed into that. It's also, unfortunately, par for the course that they're going to hype this up. And one thing that we've seen from CBC, our beloved state broadcaster, is that they are trying to turn this into a old reform versus old, kinder, gentler, nicer PC conservatives. Chris D'Entremont's just an old-fashioned East Coast, Nova Scotia, red Tory. Oh, he's also a pro-lifer, by the way. You guys hate them. You hate pro-lifers.
Let's not talk about that.
Been on the record with that. He first ran under Andrew Scheer, who is as much a fiscal hawk as Pierre Poilievre is. Poilievre and Scheer are tied at the hip. Scheer, despite being former leader, is Poilievre's right-hand man. He's the House leader. Those two are thick as thieves. And D'Entremont decided to run under Scheer, who's also a SOCON, just like D'Entremont is. But you're going to tell me it's some kind of, red Tory, blue Tory fight? Give me a break. This is media narrative trying to shape the story in ways that it shouldn't be. What I tried to do on my piece, and if you haven't seen it, I just did, it was like, forget the word count. It was like 2,500, 3,000 words. I did just a deep dive, a download of everything that I knew, tried to give as much background as I could on the D'Entremont situation, on the Matt Genereux situation, on, are there disgruntled MPs within the Conservative caucus? Yes, but not for the reasons that most of the media are going to tell you. So I tried to do that because there is, interest in this, obviously, but there's also a lot of misinformation.
100%. And the one thing that I keep hearing, especially from some of these pundits and from the Liberals themselves, is they keep going back to Pierre talking about the RCMP over and over and over again.
Yeah,
and
he did that on some whack job show, right?
Yeah, some crazy right-wing YouTube channel.
That was with you.
Yes, some crazy right-wing YouTube channel. But the thing that just it really bothers me that the media is not going after Mark Carney for publicly coming out and decrying the Supreme Court ruling on child pornography and the mandatory minimums that they struck down. There's been not a peep from the Liberal caucus at all about this, other than, well, we're going to be putting in legislation in the future, but they haven't addressed it at all. And they only spent a couple of days during the election on the whole issue of Paul Chang and the him calling for Joe Tay to be abducted, and a bounty being claimed. Now, whether or not that was sarcasm or not, it's a big problem, and they didn't spend a lot of time on that, and they didn't spend a lot of time on Mark Carney defending this guy, but they're spending all this time on seemingly trying to paint Pierre as this is the end of days for him. He should just resign, and they're trying to fuel rumors that he's going to be out of here. But I don't think he's going anywhere anytime soon.
Look, never expect the mainstream media to give conservatives the same fair shake that they give liberals. It's just never going to happen. And I know you know that already, Ryan, but just never expect it, because they're just not built that way. Majority of the parliamentary press gallery are large L liberals. They would tell you that they're not. They would tell you that they are neutral arbiters of truth and justice in the Canadian way, even though they import American ideas all the time. And they would tell you that they're fair to the conservatives, and yet they hold them to completely different standards. In my time in the parliamentary press gallery, you were more likely to find a New Democrat than a conservative. And we all have our own viewpoints, and some of us are pundits, and I've been a pundit for a long time. I'm paid for my opinion. So yeah, for everyone screaming, yeah, but Lily, you give your opinion. Well, if I didn't, I'd be unemployed, because that's what my boss pays me to do. But there's a whole bunch of journalists who are supposed to be straight by the book reporters, as I was for many years, where you just report the facts. And I'm not sure that most of them do it with malice. They just swim in the same water all the time. They can't tell that there is anything else out there except what they see. And so they don't know what to do with someone like Pierre Poilievre. Now, I'll say this. Pierre's answer to your very valid question about what do you do with if someone in your caucus was caught doing all the things that happened in Trudeau's caucus, he didn't need to go where he did. But you are right about the obsession of the gallery in being far more interested in that than in the comments about arresting and deporting Joe Tay, or Carney and Brookfield, or Carney in anything, or Trudeau in anything. I mean, it's been a frustration of mine for years, and I learned to live with it by taking my dog outside and going for a walk and staring at trees and flowers, because otherwise I might lose my mind in terms of how biased the media are in Canada, and yet they will tell you that they're not, and it's not that way. And yet, if you turn on the TV any day of the week at 5 p.m. and put it on CBC News Network, I don't recommend it. It's bad for your health. But if you did, you would see a bald man responding to everything said by a conservative with, well, but hold on now, let me just give you the liberal talking point. And he doesn't do that to every other pundit who's liberal or New Democrat. That doesn't happen. It only happens to the conservatives. And that's just one example of how bad things are. And, that person will tell you that they are 100% neutral and just trying to give the truth and trying to spread the word. No, that's not the case. So conservatives always have to know that they are held to a completely different standard. I mean, Stephen Harper faced weeks of complaints over using the term old stock Canadian, which had been used multiple times until he said it. Then it became a problem.
One of the things that we kind of cling to, especially in how we try and present ourselves, is the fact that good journalism allows democracy to actually function. And the death of journalistic integrity is the death of democracy. So 2 questions for you. A, do you believe that? And if so, B, what are Canadians to do when they recognize this and say, well, how are we supposed to have a functioning democracy when the vast majority of the mainstream media is only serving to influence the way Canadians view our 2 political parties, rather than reporting on the facts of the main 2 political parties?
So I came out of broadcasting. I started in radio, then went into TV, and then finally I'm in print and online. So unlike most of my colleagues, I've worked in every aspect of the media. I was, in fact, long before I went into radio, I was doing online stuff in late '90s, early 2000s, in the dinosaur age of the internet. Um, in broadcasting, you are expected to be neutral because you use the public airways. But in print, the Toronto Sun, I could lean over into the cabinet facing the desk I'm sitting in, pull out the first edition of the Toronto Sun, November 1st, 1971. And it's very much opposed to a guy named Trudeau, who was prime minister at the time. And I like to joke that the Toronto Sun was founded after the death of the Toronto Telegram to oppose a guy named Trudeau. And until recently, we were still opposing a guy named Trudeau. Newspapers have a very definitive viewpoint, and they wear that with pride. Some people will tell you, oh, no, the Star's not a liberal paper. No, the Star's a liberal paper, and anyone that knows the Star knows that. And the Globe and Mail is the establishment paper, and they take particular points of view with their editorials. TV and radio traditionally haven't done that. They have tried to claim that they are neutral. They are anything but neutral. And I think that we would all be, well, a lot better served if people just admitted their biases. I worked for years in talk radio, and in Canada, private talk radio is predominantly seen as more conservative, and it is. But there have always been hosts. Let's point to one who's now in Mark Carney's cabinet, like Evan Solomon. Evan would have told you for years, oh, I'm not liberal, I'm just neutral. Well, sorry, Evan, but all of your talking points were liberal when you were on air, on TV, and on radio. And now you're in the liberal cabinet. Nobody is shocked by that. He would have been a much more interesting host if he had admitted that he was a liberal. Just like, whether it's Jerry Agar in Toronto or Bill Carroll in Ottawa or Evan Bray, across the prairies. These guys admit where they're coming from and they say, well, you can agree with me or disagree with me. I think that we would be better served by a media that did that than, oh no, I'm just telling you the truth, but I'm only going to tell you the liberal truth. And I'm going to make conservatives look as bad as possible and liberals as good as possible. I think that I tend to be fair, Ryan. And when Mark Carney does something that is worth praising him for, like the bail reform a little while ago, I say yes. And my biggest complaint with the Carney government lately is that they won't live up to what they promised. And what did they promise? We will think big, act bigger, move at speeds not seen in generations to build the Canadian economy. Guess what? I want that. But guess what? They're not delivering. They're getting in their own way. They're letting liberal ideology slow things down. If we were all just a bit more honest about where we're coming from in terms of coverage, the public would be better served. So people that agree with me are going to love me, and people that disagree with me, they can say, well, I take what Lily says with a grain of salt, but I agree with them on this, or I hate him all the time. But this false idea that you've got a bunch of lefty liberals on the Hill covering our federal politics and claiming to be neutral just doesn't wash anymore. A good chunk of the viewing public sees through it. Not everyone, but a good chunk do.
Well, and hopefully more and more people are able to see this and understand what it is. And I think the numbers are starting to prove that, because you're starting to see less and less people tune in and engage to this. It's a wonder that the CBC doesn't want to talk about their numbers whenever they're called to committee. But in terms of this budget and what it means, a lot of people we've talked to have postulated that this government is not going to last very long. And you got the sense, even from Scott Reid when he was talking about this budget, that sure, Carney's planning on doing all these things, but they're not even going to take effect for 2 to 3 years. And that's a different political time frame than Canadians are looking for. And never mind the fact that there's not really any affordability measures in this budget, which Canadians want. The majority of Canadians wanted to see fiscal restraint and spending cut. They're not seeing that. And a lot of conservative voters out there are wanting an election now. We've said this is going to be the worst time for an election, and that the best thing right now is for the Liberals to have this budget pass and then wear it for the next 6 months to allow the swing voter Canadians to actually realize that this budget actually isn't doing anything to help me. And to your point, they're not living up to their promises of moving at speeds. The only thing that they've accelerated on is spending, from what we can see. So I think that from a public opinion point of view, this budget is going to age very poorly, very quickly, and we may be having a very different conversation after the NDP race completes in March of next year. That's our take. What do you see happening over the next 6 months, assuming the budget passes?
Well, that's assuming the budget passes. And I watched an interesting clip from Mike Donison. And Mike is someone who's been around conservative circles for a very long time. I've met him a couple of times. Don't know him, but he was speaking at a university lecture hall. And back in 1979, Mike Donison was a young staffer to the defense minister in Joe Clark's government, a guy named McKinnon. And he described what it was like as they moved. He had nothing to do with the government rising or falling, but he had a front row seat to how Joe Clark's government fell because they miscalculated the votes. And that could happen here. And he did point out that another young staffer on the Hill at the time was a 25-year-old kid named Michael Sabia, who's now the clerk of the Privy Council, the top bureaucrat in Canada under Mark Carney. So we could stumble into an election. I've heard Scott Reid on Curse of Politics the other day talk about, the spring being a very good time for the Liberals to go. He's not the first person that I've heard that from, the Liberals could be looking at that, or next fall at the latest. But in my view, that's only beneficial to the Liberals if Mark Carney delivers. And my read of the Canadian public is that if he delivers, they'll reward him. His polling numbers are still solid, even if you look at the most favorable polls for the Conservatives, such as Abacus. You look at the Abacus poll numbers and you go back and forth and you say, okay, depending on how this splits out, we're still looking at a minority. Is it a Conservative or a Liberal? You look at a poll like Leger, it would most likely be a Liberal majority. But then you look at the background numbers in the Leger, and it's, are you satisfied with how things are going? And on Trump, on affordability, on cost of living, on housing, all the big issues, it's between 62 and 71% say, I'm not satisfied. So if Carney gets this budget passed, doesn't get a deal with Trump over the next several months, and remember, in 2026, we're going into the U.S. midterms, nobody's going to be pushing for a deal with Canada. Free trade is not going to be popular with either party, in my view, in the 2026 midterms. So if we don't get a deal with Trump by late January, mid-February, we're just going to be shoved back. So, he's going to have a budget that, as you say, I think you're correct, is not going to wear well long term. If he doesn't have a deal with Trump, that was his big selling point in the last election. And growing the economy while holding on to all these liberal things that's stopping him from moving as fast as he promised, that's really difficult. And so he's not going to be in a great position. And I think at a certain point, people are going to say, look, buddy, we gave you the job because you said you'd deliver and you're not delivering, and maybe we should look elsewhere. Does that mean they turn to Poilievre and the Conservatives? Does it mean they give a weaker minority? It's too tough to tell. As I kept saying, in the lead up to the last election, voters are fickle, polls can change, campaigns matter. No party should ever take anything for granted, especially not now. We have been in a minority situation for most of the last 20 plus years. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. We'll have the odd majority government. We've had two in that time, and the rest have been minority parliaments. So people are willing to flip back and forth. And it's those swing voters in the middle that you got to figure out how to attract. And how do you get them on your side? Well, if Carney's not delivering, they're going to say, okay, well, maybe I give this other guy a chance.